All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If you're new, welcome. Everyone else, can you believe it? I just can't believe what has unfolded over the last week. When I was last speaking to you, it had just been the day after, like the first day in Minneapolis, that we saw something happening, and it certainly got much worse over the course of the week. And, I have had some conversations on the show about institutional and systemic racism. And if there's one thing I've learned is that it's not really for me to be making any big statements about it. Right now, it's about actions. It's not about words. And I realized that I was talking to some friends just the other day. It's not always clear what to do. And it's not like I would have any answers for anyone. Certainly, there are resources out there that are hoping to educate people on things that they can do. For myself, I guess I'm just talking to the people around me. Well, just this morning, I kind of got into it with my father-in-law. I'm here in Virginia, and longtime listeners have heard me mention that we make trips here. I mentioned a few weeks ago that we decided to pay them a visit. I'm here for my birthday, actually. I turn 48 tomorrow, and we just decided that we've all been isolated for months, and we wanted to take the risk to be together, and I'm glad that we have. It's really been wonderful to be with family. Even when me and my father-in-law get into it about stuff, and it didn't get bad, like some of you remember from years past. We've had it out on things. This morning we just, we got into some discussion because when the people around me are not making any distinctions between protesters and looters, and seem to want to give the excessive force of the police a pass, I'm going to say something about that because I think that the people around me should understand that the viewpoint that they are expressing is exactly why people are on the streets. And, at first it didn't go so well this morning, but just now, this afternoon, we sat down in the gazebo together, and we actually did come to quite a bit of agreement, and I think everybody is so understandably raw and scared. I think everybody's scared. I think the police are scared. I think protesters are scared. I think I'm scared. I think my father-in-law is scared. And we really just don't have a lot of voices or leaders out there who seem to be finding ways of bringing us together, And I think that's because we can't come together until we address the root causes of this. Police are killing black people in ways that they do not kill white people. And until we are able to acknowledge that and take steps, it seems like there's some smart people out there who are suggesting actual policy things, defunding them, which I heard somebody freaking about the other day and saying, what, you say you don't want to have police? No, I don't think that's what defunding the police means. I think it means they don't have to be the military. There's a great article that Rushkoff wrote, which was called Good Cops Don't Need Grenade Launchers. And I think that's true. In any case, maybe I've already inflamed some of you, you see? I've easily just now made some of you annoyed or upset with me who might not agree with the things I'm saying. But I do think we need to try to talk about them. That's a lot of what this show has always been about. I did decide to engage one other person directly in the same regard that I did with my father-in-law. I was on Facebook for a minute, and There's this one guy I know from my childhood. He grew up down the street from me. We used to play as kids. And he's a Christian and a Trump supporter, and he is sort of diametrically opposed to me on the political spectrum. And yet, when I've seen his posts over the years, I still get the feeling that he's a good person and he cares about people, even though it seems like we have alternate realities or something sometimes. So in any case, I saw him post out a list of Black-owned businesses that were looted by Antifa. And it was just, again, this subtle conflation of looting that happened and the entire protest movement. It's all Antifa. And I decided to write him a direct note. I didn't make a comment on the post. I wrote him a direct message. And I just felt like, can I reach out to this person who I once knew in my life, who just sees things so differently than me? And can I express to him a different viewpoint and try to share with him why I think what he's saying is wrong? And can we potentially not fight, but come to something mutual? I just thought I wanted to try for some reason with my old friend Rick. And so I wrote him a long note, and you know what? It actually was a really good thing to do because he did respond, and he agreed with a lot of what I said, and I was really surprised. He did not defend the president, which he usually does. And I don't know. I'm saying all this because I suppose that's the least we can do, is talk to people in our lives about this stuff. But certainly more than that needs to be done. I guess we each just at some point have to decide what's more important. That your fellow human beings, regardless of the color of their skin, are being treated humanely in the way that you would wish to be treated, or anything else. What's more important? And I hope everyone out there is doing what they can to be on the side of justice. And as if we weren't already feeling totally tweaked with this whole pandemic. Crazy how the protests, whatever the whole craze of the pandemic, it took a second seat, didn't it? And I wonder, does that mean in 2 weeks we're going to see big spikes of more cases? Who knows? And I do talk about that some with today's guest, Timothy McCall. Frankly, I didn't necessarily expect to get into the stuff that we got into. I reached out to Timothy. You'll hear we speak about it some because in my mind, he represented a certain viewpoint that I was interested to talk to. But once we got into it, we went to all sorts of interesting and I think relevant places. Just to note that we recorded this before all of the protests started. So we don't talk about that at all. But we certainly talk about personal choice and discernment and reductionist science. So I think it's an important conversation and I really appreciated it. And I'm very glad that you're going to hear it today. Real quick before we do, let me just mention that this episode is brought to you in support by podcast premium subscribers Deborah Kistner and Gregory Land. We are so grateful for people who've chosen to become podcast premium subscribers. Not only do you get access to the full archives, it's also the best way to help support and sustain this show. So thank you, Deborah and Gregory. If you want to learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or find out about any of my stuff, go to jbrownyoga.com. All right, y'all. I think I'm just going to leave it there. As I mentioned, I'm not at home in my usual routines, and I have a feeling the dinner bell is about to ring. So I will touch base with you on the other side. But for now, let's go ahead and get to this conversation that I had with Timothy McCall.
Hello?
Hello, Timothy. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you. How about you?
All things considered, I'm okay. It comes and goes. It's just such a bizarre time.
Yeah. No. I think, as I recall, you had closed your studio a while back. Is that right?
I did. That was about, 3 years ago?
Okay. So that, at least, because I know studios are having just huge problems now.
It's true. And, I let go of mine 3 years ago and moved to Pennsylvania and actually moved a bunch of stuff online. So I already was doing online classes and a lot of stuff that people scramble to do, so.
Right. Yeah.
But gosh, where are you?
I am in Burlington, Vermont these days.
Oh, all right. Sanders territory, but we won't go there because it's upsetting. But, Timothy, we've only really been, I don't know, maybe we've been in the same room a couple of times, but there's one time I heard you speak. It was at the IAYT Sitar conference in 2009 in Los Angeles.
Okay, right. Yeah.
Do you remember that? I mean, do you remember the conference? Not me. You wouldn't remember me. I was just in a big crowd. But do you remember that conference?
I absolutely remember. I mean, how could we forget with all the power outages, et cetera?
That's right.
And also, that talk I gave was like the most scandalous thing that had happened in the world of yoga therapy ever. I got so much. Most people loved it, but certain researchers and stuff thought I was being unscientific. Blah blah blah.
Can you remind me of what that was? Because I have a reason for remembering it, which I will tell you about, but it wasn't necessarily a topic. Tell me again what it was about and why was it a controversy?
Well, it's still a controversy. I mean, basically, I have been saying that the way we research yoga, where we take something that's at its heart a holistic, individualized phenomenon, and we reduce it to a standard protocol based on medical diagnosis. That first step that we do to conform to the strictures of evidence-based medicine, it means that we're studying something that's a really crappy third-rate imitation of yoga therapy, and that if you really want to understand yoga therapy, you actually need to understand what the people who are doing this field actually do, which is not that.
Well, it's interesting because now I remember exactly why I was in your talk because I was there because there was the Council of Schools Initiative meetings happening, which was those very first meetings, and I was starting a training program.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to just say a 200-hour teacher training because there was all these like power flow trainings, and I was doing this Desikachar inspired thing, and I was trying to fit it into the 200-hour model, but I was teaching, the same stuff that yoga therapists do, but I was teaching it in what I was calling like a more preventative care way rather than a clinical way.
Okay.
And so in those meetings, I definitely lost the argument. I mean, I tried to convince them to do like an entry-level 200-hour baseline therapeutic yoga standard to compete with what I thought was the bogus Yoga Alliance 200 and have that be the requisite for the 800 or 1,500-hour clinical standard they were developing.
Right.
But I totally didn't win that argument. But I certainly, what you were saying appealed to me because I was really interested in this idea of how kind of the allopathic frame didn't always allow for what seemed to me, like you said, this holistic phenomena, or it would sort of, in some ways, they can work together, but they're not the same and they can't be the same or something.
Right.
Right. But the funny part is, and this is a totally silly side note, but the thing that I also remember for you for is that I had this really dumb idea about PowerPoint presentations for some reason, where I had it in my mind that using PowerPoint was like cheating or something. Like I was supposed to know the information and have it in hand. And if I didn't, I hadn't really retained it.
Uh-huh.
But when I saw you speak with a PowerPoint, I realized, wait a second, you were talking about some pretty technical stuff like medical jargon that was way out of my ballpark. And the slides helped me. I got it. I was like, oh, wait, dummy. This is better. This is better for students to understand what you're saying. So
I hate to burst your bubble here.
Yeah.
But there was no PowerPoint during that presentation.
Not during the keynote. You gave another talk.
Oh, the one on the physiology of stress. Okay.
Yes. You gave another talk, not the keynote, but there was another talk.
Okay.
I went to the other talk because of the keynote.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah. But it just dispelled me of this dumb idea. I mean, I don't use it a lot, but I realized the benefit of it, and you were the one who gave me that. So
that's interesting because it's because in my own trainings now, I have moved away from PowerPoints. And
that's so amazing you say that, because at that time, that was 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago now, I thought of you as being like the guy who had the medical lens. Like you could speak you were a doctor for 10 years.
Right.
So I thought of you that way then. But now, 10 years later, I do think of you as almost like a little bit more of the other side. Like, because here's why I reached out to you to speak to you even, is that right now, I'm really intrigued by how there are these aspects of yoga that I feel have benefited me most. And they're often a little bit more like, I don't know how to say it, like the mystical side of it, or like the stuff that science can't really explain is where I'm most interested, actually.
Right. Yeah.
And yet that's not to discount science. And right now, like even during the pandemic, there seems to be this thing where if you talk about intuition or something, it's almost considered like irresponsible, or like you're not listening, because that might be encouraging people to not listen to the CDC or something like that. So I even just wrote this thing about it where it's, well, how do we like take into account the best science, but also like still trust our own ability to know truth from within? And so for me, you're kind of the exact person I want to talk to. And I guess just to get us started, and you may have spoken about this before, and I'm sorry if you have, but I haven't heard it, and I don't know that the people listening to this will have. Why, after being a doctor for 10 years, did you decide to dedicate yourself to yoga and yoga therapy?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, the context at that time, which was the late 1990s in Boston, was that corporate managed care was taking over healthcare in the state. And what was happening at that time was that industrial concepts like throughput, which in medical care translates to how many patients you can see in a set period of time, that was being encouraged. So we were supposed to be seeing people faster. And the parts of medicine that I most enjoyed, educating patients, getting to know them, getting to know a little bit more about their lives to help me give them better health care, were all the parts of the bean counters considered not important. And there was an infamous saying by the head of a quite infamous HMO called U.S. Healthcare at that time. And his little saying was, if you can't count it, it doesn't count. Which is basically the exact opposite of what you're talking about with your experience with yoga, or the parts that are the hardest to measure, but which yet to the practitioner are palpable, are discounted.
Great.
And of course, that was very convenient for the corporate agenda of lowering the cost and not paying for certain things like psychotherapy, which don't have very good scientific support. And so they'd much rather pay for someone to be on an antidepressant drug than to pay for psychotherapy.
Right.
So that was, to me, just becoming a progressively, that to me was becoming a progressively just more and more intolerable situation where I was being sped up, where I wasn't able to give people the care I felt they deserved. My first book was a book called Examining Your Doctor. In examining your doctor, I tried to teach people how to judge the quality of their medical care and to take a more active role in deciding what happened to them. Because my belief was that most medical decisions were not all about science, although science is part of it, but they were really a reflection of value judgments. You take this intervention, there's a certain chance it'll cause harm and a certain chance that it'll cause very significant harm, and there's a certain chance that it's going to help you. And the question is, how do you weigh those factors and then decide what to do? And I think largely that's a value judgment, but that's a value judgment that physicians often kind of impose on their patients. And I think when a medical decision depends on value judgments, that would be the patient's values and not the doctor's values.
That's really interesting. How do you think you came to have that viewpoint as a doctor? Were you already into yoga at that time, or?
I was not. At the time, it was interesting. At the time I quit, I quit practicing medicine in 1997. And at the time I quit, I had been practicing asana for 2 years. And I think I've been doing a little pranayama as well at that point. But, it had a teacher. No, my first style was Iyengar yoga, but I had the fortune of having Patricia Walden, who was a very spiritually minded woman and a very kind and generous woman who doesn't have an angry or a hypercritical bone in her body. So I was very lucky to be in that kind of environment. And, I have sometimes wondered whether my decision, I came home from the clinic one day after a particularly grueling day where I just gotten hammered all day long. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table in my apartment in Cambridge, and I had this epiphany. You don't have to do this anymore. Your writing career has already been really successful. You could just be a writer. You don't have to do this anymore. And it was one of those moments where I had that epiphany, and within 10 minutes, it was kind of a done deal emotionally. It took me another 6 months to extract myself from my practice. But I made that decision right then and there. And I think that willingness to tune into my intuition and to when I recognized that it felt right to go with it, even though a lot of people thought I was insane. Or the other thing I got from a whole bunch of people at that time was, you are so brave. Like, I'm brave because I'm like following what seems like completely right to me. And I'll tell you something, it didn't feel the least bit brave to me. It felt like, duh, I got to do this and I don't care. But to other people, walking away from medicine seemed like a brave thing. Now, of course, the interesting thing is with my pursuit of yoga therapy and yoga and all these things, I'm using my medical training every day. Mm-hmm. And even my take on the limitations of evidence-based medical approaches to studying yoga therapy is based on the fact that I was a clinician for 10 years. And yes, we want to be guided by the evidence, but the reality is there is no evidence that has ever been done for all kinds of clinical decisions that doctors need to make every day. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we want to be guided by science, but we don't want to let it misguide us. And when we overrule the feedback of our body and our intuition, sometimes we're actually doing something wrong.
Wow. I mean, that is exactly what I just wrote about and published yesterday, because that experience that you described where you were at an inflection point in your life, right? And in that inflection point, there was an obvious choice, which was, dummy, you're a doctor. Are you kidding? You're going to give up being a doctor? Like, it's like every mom's dream or whatever, like you have the one of the penultimate careers in our society or whatever.
And I can tell you just a little funny addition.
Yeah.
My mother was quite the independent woman, and I called her up after that 10-minute interval where I'd made the decision, and I announced to her my plans. She thought it was hilarious. She approved.
That's great. See, that's great. That's great. At least you had that support, because I think a lot of other people thought you were crazy. As you said, I would have thought that's kind of crazy to give up being a doctor for yoga. I mean, but I guess at that time it was a more exciting time for yoga too, frankly. That's when I got into it. I started practicing like 93. I started teaching in 97.
Right.
And it was a much more like upward trajectory for yoga. It actually did feel like there was a big future for being a yoga teacher or something at that time. But it is incredible to me that experience that you have about listening, as you said, tuning into my intuition and making an unconventional choice that felt right to you, even though you can't explain why to somebody.
And the other thing I have to say is that is now, almost was approaching 25 years ago. And I have never looked back and regretted it, not even for a single day.
See, it's interesting, so interesting, because that idea that you tap into an inner wisdom, like I've heard it being spoken about right now in this context, is almost delusional, that we have to be listening. And you even said this idea of like evidence. And I'm distrustful sometimes, especially when I can see contradictory interpretations and data from reputable sources on both sides when it's not clear, like the science is evolving and there isn't like a already established definitive explanation for something.
Well, especially when we're talking now about, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, by definition, nobody knows what's going on. Everybody's flying by the seat of their pants. And the idea that we exactly know based on the science, I mean, certainly there's public health stuff, which has been well tested in lots of different kinds of pandemics, but this is a different one. This is a novel coronavirus, meaning no one's ever seen it before. And it's got different characteristics than any prior pandemic. And scientists are only starting to sort some of this stuff out. And so the idea that there's hard and fast stuff, no. There's also, common sense. There's also the idea of erring on the side of safety until we do figure it out. I mean, some of those things, I think, just make sense. But can anybody cite a randomized controlled trial on the proper approach to COVID-19? No, they can't, because there aren't. They take longer than that to come about.
Yeah, I guess the accusations I've heard is that if you express that kind of nuance like you express, because you didn't just say don't listen to the guidelines or whatever, that when you express that kind of nuance, it's potentially like sowing the seeds of conspiracy and misinformation and potentially harm.
Well, it's interesting to me, because let me use the example of vaccines. Now, even though vaccines are often heavily criticized in the world of complementary alternative medicine, I, in many instances, am a pro-vaccine person. I think that we kind of forget what happened with the polio epidemic and some of these other things that caused millions of people to die and have serious problems, sequelae, consequences of these infections, that many of which are preventable by vaccines. Now, but the thing is now that if you acknowledge that vaccines have side effects, and of course, vaccines are reductionist medical interventions. Of course they have side effects. But the question is, do the side effects, are they outweighed by the benefits? But it's become this environment where if you even mention the potential of side effects to a vaccine, then you're helping all the anti-vaxxers. And so we're not actually even allowed to have an honest conversation that, there do appear to be credible sources that talk about there being some vaccines that seem to cause some problems. But people don't want to muddy the water. They don't want anyone to think that vaccines are a bad idea. So we're actually not allowed to have a really honest conversation about them. And I think that I think that's kind of the same thing you're talking about with COVID-19 right now. And I get it, because there are people who want to blow off the science and just do whatever they feel like. And a nuanced argument can then be cut and spliced, and the one thing you said then becomes the motivation for doing something that's kind of crazy.
Right.
And I get that, but I think that I think that we should be a mature enough society where experts can disagree, and then it's okay, and that sometimes as a patient, you're gonna, and this of course happens to people who have cancer and other conditions, where one doctor tells you one thing and you go for a second opinion, and that doctor tells you something quite different. And like, how is this a problem? The thing is, these are complex things, and different people are allowed to have different opinions, and you've got to figure out which argument and which clinician you resonate with more, and then choose the thing that makes the most sense for you. When I went through my own cancer a few years ago, I did things that my oncologist did not recommend. Like, I fasted during chemotherapy, for example, which definitely greatly decreased my risk of side effects from chemotherapy. And I think also there's at least animal evidence that it probably also increased my chance of a cure. But that's considered like kind of dangerous, crazy stuff, even to my family members, including one of whom is a very prestigious physician.
No, wait a second. Let me stop you there before we get to the cancer and how you got through that, because I wanted to get there. I want to first finish maybe something that you were talking about in terms of vaccines, because I am a father, have 2 children, and I remember we had to decide about vaccinations, and I did all this research, and I read the anti-vax, and then I read the science, and ultimately we didn't have that much options. Like, what you had to do in New York to not vaccinate your kids was a lot. So we did decide to do it, but we also decided to alter the schedule because we felt like having them do so many at one time when they were young felt weird. So we wanted to be able to see if they had a reaction or something. So I don't know, we spread it out, and we did have a pediatrician who worked with us and altered the schedule for us. But
actually, that is one of my primary problems with childhood vaccinations. They just pile so many on top of each other in such a short interval. And my reasoning is if you're going to give her 3 different ones at the same time, and it's like they're first getting vaccinated, how do you know which one they had a reaction to? There's no way to know. So I thought if we do more one at a time and we can spread them out, we would know. Well, I mean,
that would be helpful maybe. I don't know if I knew anything, but that was my reasoning at the time.
Well, and I'll give you an example from my own life. When I was due to start my medical residency, they wanted proof of either prior infection with measles, mumps, and rubella, or that you'd been vaccinated. I had measles and rubella, German measles, as a kid, just natural infections, and I got over them and developed antibodies. But I never had mumps as a kid. And mumps in young men is potentially very dangerous because it can cause problems with the testicles. And so I decided that I would get an MMR, I would get a mumps vaccination. Well, they didn't have the mumps vaccine, and my insurance company wouldn't pay for the mumps vaccine. But they would pay free of charge for the MMR vaccine. And I'm like, no, man, that's crazy. I've already had measles. I've already had measles and rubella, and you want me to take a vaccine that has those 2 things in it just so I can get the one I need? That's stupid. I'm not doing that. And so I paid out of my own pocket to have that mumps vaccine because I didn't want to take the chance on 2 vaccines I didn't need.
I guess that goes to the other question I had in my head. And I asked this to someone else who didn't know, and maybe this isn't your area of expertise and you don't know either, but I have had some vaccinations myself, and I think they're less than what my kids had. I don't know that for sure, but my kids did have, like you mentioned, polio vaccine, but I've never gotten, nor have my children ever gotten, a flu shot.
Right.
And is there a difference there? Because it seems like the flu shot is always this moving target. And I read some things that says that flu shot actually potentially helps you, makes you more prone to getting the flu. And then other people said that's bogus, that's conspiracy theories. And it's hard to know. Is there a difference in your mind?
A difference between adult flu shots and pediatric vaccines? Is that the question?
Yeah, between like a polio vaccine for children, so we don't have polio in the world, and like adults getting flu shots.
Well, I mean, so there are two things that happens with vaccinations. One is that you potentially protect the individual against infection. And the second is that you potentially affect the people who might have been infected by the person had they not been vaccinated. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of herd immunity idea, right? And so both are potentially operative. So, for example, back when I was practicing medicine, I did get flu shots, not to protect myself, but to protect my elderly patients from catching it from me.
I see. Because you can pass flu on to people even though you're not having symptoms.
There's certainly, and it's more pronounced with COVID-19 than the other infections. There can be a period where you're not yet symptomatic, or where you're hardly symptomatic at all, when you're actually quite infectious.
Gotcha.
And my understanding is that that the flu shots can sometimes, even if they're not totally successful, they may decrease your chance of coming to serious harm if you are infected. So they may have some beneficial effect. And then, of course, then there's this whole business of the additives to the vaccine. Like, do we really need to have aluminum and other stuff in vaccines? And left to their own devices, manufacturers find it convenient for keeping the vaccines viable longer, et cetera. But we don't need any more aluminum than we've already got in our bodies. So that's not a good idea. So that again is kind of taking a more nuanced view and trying to decide what to do. And so I think we all need to make our own judgments and make our own decisions. And sometimes, though, as you is suggesting with childhood vaccinations in New York, parents may not actually have much choice.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you. It does seem to me that there is this thing, and it bears relevance to our current situation right now, and why some people get upset when people try to speak in nuanced ways is, I guess there's sometimes your decisions and policy are based on like an idea of equal outcomes. Like the example you gave is similar to like my wife when she was trying to get pregnant a second time. She had an ectopic pregnancy, and I know we went to the hospital. It's a long story to make it shorter. And they wanted to give her an exam that I knew she didn't need. And I had to like sign a waiver. I had to really fight them, And I knew that they were making those decisions because in some sense, maybe they have to mitigate liability. And it's to make sure to like cover their asses so that if something did go wrong, we couldn't sue them or whatever it was. But it seems like sometimes choices, like especially when it's like on a mass public health level, they have to be made in a kind of crude way with this idea that there's going to be as equal an outcome as possible or something.
Right. So and those are two separate things. One is the kind of problem of medical malpractice, and then physicians who alter the way they practice to try to lower that risk of getting sued. And interesting thing was, back when I was practicing medicine, I just felt like really communicate well with patients and to develop good relationships with them. And then the data at that time, I haven't reviewed it for a long time now, the data at that time suggested that bad relationships are why patients sue doctors, not bad outcomes.
Interesting. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, even in the room when we were back at that IAYT conference, that was one of the things that everybody acknowledged. I wrote about that one of the things that everybody was doing was like valuing this idea that you just said of relationship, that it wasn't just like a patient number, but it was a person. Relating to them actually made all the techniques work.
And when doctors, by the way, admit their mistake and apologize, that sometimes is all that needs to happen to make that threat of litigation go away. Now, I'm not trying to say that this is always. And I had a friend who actually went through one of my best buddies from medical school. He was sued 3 times in a couple of month period, and in none of the cases was he the primary physician. He was just a consultant on the case in the hospital, but they cast a wide net, the malpractice attorneys. And so he got roped into 3 different cases. And he's like one of the best clinicians. And this guy won the award in my medical school for the most compassionate medical student in the class. Okay. This guy is like a mensch, but he just because of the peculiarities of our system and this idea of trying to bring in the deep pockets, even if they don't actually have any personal culpability, because that's just the way the legal system works. It does lead to bad things, and physicians are sometimes put in an impossible situation. So and that led to a real kind of midlife crisis for my friend, and he really wondered how to go forward, what to do, and it messed with him. So I think we need to have compassion for physicians here too.
I hear that. I think that's actually a case for why the for-profit healthcare system is so unjust for everybody involved. But to go back to the other thing that you said, because I did sort of follow it as it happened and was so glad to hear you pull through, but you did have a cancer diagnosis. When did that happen?
So it happened 2 days before Thanksgiving, 2016. And basically, I had a stage 4A oral cancer, actually a tumor on my tonsil that had metastasized to 3 lymph nodes on the opposite side of my neck. And that's what made it a stage 4A cancer. And it was an HPV-related, human papillomavirus-related cancer. And basically, I started treatment. So one of the things that happened, because I had a family member who had cancer, and this family member had advised me that there was no way I was getting treated before the first of the year, because with the holidays coming up and it takes so long to even get an appointment with some oncologist, this person was just saying, there's no way you're going to do this. So what I actually did was, when I got my diagnosis, I planned to return to the States the first of the year. That was what I was going to need to do anyway, because I was changing the state I lived in to change my insurance. I had to wait for the first year anyway. I went and spent a month in India and got Ayurvedic care to balance me and put me in a good place to then undergo what was about to happen with the chemotherapy and radiation and stuff that I had. So and I basically had to craft my own plan, because I was at a first-rate world-class cancer center that was really old school as far as.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.